Start about 10 minutes earlier, and I hope you won't mind that, and I hope that you will join us later for right after this for a little reception. But now I'm pleased to introduce our last speaker of the day, Diane Burko. Before I introduce her, I want to observe that the speakers today have more than an interest in the environment in common. I would call them morphers, if there's such a word. As the world changes, they expand their expertise and their passions into new discoveries and new challenges. Diane is a painter, but in 2006, she reoriented her practice of art to the intersection of art, science, and the environment. Her work now, large-scale paintings and photographs, is developed in close collaboration with glaciologists, documented disappearance of glaciers, etc. Now she'll tell you what she's doing now, and please welcome her to the podium.
Well, this has been such an incredible day. I want to thank all the other speakers. I've learned things and I've been so entertained. Seeing. And it is about seeing, but it's also about learning and knowing. And kind of presentation I'm going to give you is full of pictures, going very quickly because I've been doing this for more than 40 years, and I know you don't want a long art history, lecture that's going to go on to cover all that. So I'm going to be going at a pretty fast clip, but what I want to share with you is my process and how my journey has evolved. And I want to also mention that my journey is like a lot of other artists. I'm what you call a research-based artist. And there are lots of us now in the world, and there are all kinds of people in the arts that are very, very concerned about the environment. Now, no one showed me how to do this, so what do I do first? Is it this? Yeah, good, okay. I just figured out how to do it. Okay, so I started out as a regular type artist, the kind of artist you think about who cares about the environment and also is involved in looking at the landscape. And that's, you think of the en plein air artist. But I'm also an explorer now, and I'm also an investigator, and I'm also an activist. So those are all the roles that I've kind of evolved into and embraced. But I think it's important to know that this has been going on with artists and the environment for, more than 2 centuries, probably more than that for sure. But think of Thomas Moran. If it wasn't for him, I don't think we'd have the first national park as quickly as we did. Or, wait, forgot about Ansel Adams and conservation. The whole conservation movement really used a lot of Adams' images when they were stirring up the political scene. And today, you have artists, much more kind of adventurous in media than me. I'm a flat person, basically. But Olafur Eliasson, an internationally known artist, this was an installation he did at this was 25, COP21, we're into 25 now. And he did this kind of an installation in other places as well. But during COP21, there are a lot of installations going on in Paris, and I might say all over the world. I mean, I was in one too. So all the artists were involved with that. And you just don't have to be an art artist, you can be a musician. This is an incredible piece, and you could see it online with YouTube, and it's just beautiful, and Greenpeace sponsored that. But I love this one, opera. We were talking about opera earlier today. Opera, okay? These guys won the Venice Biennale this year, okay? And it's all about climate change. And Ed Burtynsky is another example of photography. A great Anthropocene show that Richard and I saw when we were in Toronto just last October. So I'm gonna, as I told you, tell you about myself, and I've been doing this for a while. We have dates on these so you can tell. And I have always been interested in the environment and in big landscapes. Now, why, you might say? Well, because I grew up in an apartment building in Brooklyn. Okay, so I wanted to look at other things, and I wanted to explore. I've been very fortunate in my career. This is an example of 2 residencies that I've been able to have. One for 6 months in Giverny, and the other one in Bellagio, which probably some of the academics here maybe have done. Have you done it?
I haven't.
Oh, you should. It is so cool. It's definitely very cool. I had art historians who suggested I do it, and had to apply, of course, and it was great. I'm with, Max Planck people and all kinds of scholars, and there's one artist, one composer, and a poet. And that was a 5-week experience. But now I'm going to start again to show you a little bit of my trajectory, maybe in about 5 or 6 images. So this is the Grand Canyon. This was the first time that I realized that I no longer wanted to use other people's images, but I wanted to get my own. And I did this, and I always give credit to James Turrell. Some of you might know who he is. He's a pretty well-known light artist. And I flew with him in his Helio Courier into the Grand Canyon and took my first photographs that I then started using as the material that I would continue to use. Here's a Giverny example. Just a few years later, I was going to Costa Rica, actually because of another project I had just finished, and I wanted a change of light and color. And I had been doing green, lots of green paintings for a big public art project. And it was really funny because my friend and I went to visit her son, and he took us to the rainforest, which was great, but it was all green. But I didn't want to disappoint Andrew because he was so excited about this trip. But we hung out that night in the back of the motel. I still smoked, and we're looking up at the sky, and I see this red stuff coming down from a mountain. I said to Andrew, "What is that?" I said, "Oh, that's a volcano. That's the lava." And I had never seen a volcano before. So there happened to be a number of extant volcanoes in Costa Rica, and that began my whole fascination with volcanoes. I got a big grant and then did a project on volcanoes that lasted for about 4 years and got me all the way to Iceland, which is the most volcanic country in the world. And then I got fascinated by waterfalls. So you might see a pattern here, and it has to do with serendipity. Things happen, I respond to them, and that's how I go along. And another thing you might see in the images I showed you is a fascination with kind of monumental geological phenomenon. Okay, that seems to be what I was always interested in. But it wasn't until 2006, as Sandra pointed out, that I finally got the bug about climate change. And you asked, when did people start thinking about it? Way before then. And I knew about it, and I, read the papers and everything. But it seems like 2006 was my epiphany moment. It was the same year that Al Gore came out with his movie, and it was also the same year that Elizabeth Kolbert came out with her book. I had this exhibition at the Michener Museum, which is in Doylestown, and it was a show, basically, one curator was going to call it Ice and Snow. No, Fire and Ice, because it was all about my volcano work and also my Iceland trip. And it traveled, and when it got to the Michener, there was more room. So the curator called me up and she says, "Well, I know we already did the show at Tufts, but there's more room there. Do you have any paintings of all that ice and snow that you used to do way back in the 70s? And we found one, and there it is. And that was the painting that became my epiphany. Because as I was walking around the museum and talking about the whole show, I also, because I'm a woman, think on many levels and can do a number of things at the same time. So I'm doing my spiel, but I'm also thinking about that painting, which was acrylic. So they asked me a lot of questions because most of the paintings were oil. And I started thinking about the snow. Is the snow still there? That was done in 1976. I was having the show, in 2006. That's a 30-year, that's what I was saying. Oh my God, 30 years, so much has happened to me, blah, 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 blah. So that was really where it all began. And what I did, and I mentioned, Al Gore was in the air, Elizabeth Colbert. So I went back to 1976, started looking at the images that I was using then as a young painter. And that's where I began. And that made me look at a book that I had that was all about the Matterhorn. And I decided, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to paint the Matterhorn. And I did. I made many paintings. And I had a friend from New York, an artist friend of mine, and I was so excited. She was coming to the studio. I'm going, Lonnie, I know what I'm doing. I'm all about the climate change. Look at these paintings. I didn't have all of them. I had a few of them then. She looked at them and she said, Diane, no one's going to get it. I mean, they're just beautiful paintings of mountains. Who's going to figure that out? I said, yeah, but I'm going to make a lot of them like that. They're all about the Matterhorn. It's like an iconic image. It's in Disney World or Disneyland. It's everywhere. And she said, she's a good friend of mine, you got to do better than that. You got to get more into it. And I thought about it, and she was right. So I started going on the internet, where is the most easy place to do your research, and I learned about something called repeat photography. Repeat photography is all about what you were talking about earlier, about the data, the visual data. And I found out that USGS and Ice and Snow Center in Boulder, they all had visual data about glaciers way back. So I started looking at the data. I wrote to the scientists because I thought maybe I had to ask permission because they all had names. And I started making a series of paintings that was all about repeat photography. And we were talking about Bill McKibben earlier. Just this past year, that image was used in his discussion of the IPCC article. So there's the New York Review of Books. And I continued doing this for quite a while. For about 3 or 4 years, I was really interested in that, had a big show in Philly, made a lot of paintings. But then, because another part of my personality is that I can get bored easily. Once I figure well, not easily, but once I figure something out, I don't want to keep producing the work, because then I'm a production person, I'm not an artist. So I learned about recessional lines. Recessional lines are a way that glaciologists have tracked how glaciers are going both ways. They recede and they also advance. Of course, as we know, most of them are receding today. So I started looking at all those kind of recessional maps. This was one I put together in Photoshop of 2 glaciologists. Of course, the great Austin Post, who was one of the first ones that was documenting this, and Tad Pfeffer, who became a friend of mine at Instar in Boulder. This comes from the Woodrow Wilson School. I point that out to my friend Tim over there. So this is one of the pieces that was actually in that exhibition. After a while, Landsat maps stirred my interest. Why? Because they're beautiful. I mean, they're visually really cool. And I wanted to make paintings about that, but it was also another effort to, go more into this whole idea of glaciers. But I had to do it in a way that was informative, but yet also about painting. So here's an example of how I do paintings that are about an issue, but they're about it in many different ways. And this is a good example of what I think is aesthetics over fact. Because what you have in the first one is, this is from a photograph by Bradford Washburn, founder of the Science Museum in Boston, amongst other things. There's that Landsat map. The third one is from Bruce Molney, a USGS Alaska specialist, and I was visiting him in Reston and telling him about what I was doing. He said, oh, I got new images, I'm going to give them to you. And then the last one is from 1990, which is earlier than Bruce's. So you would think if I were a scientist doing data, they would be totally chronological, but I'm an artist doing visual stuff too. So that's why they're in that order, because it worked better visually. Here's another example of where I'm using the same Landsat, but also the sources of these are manyfold. The first one was taken when Richard and I, my husband, artist, landscape architect here, and I were in Greenland. And we're walking along the Lulusat and we're shooting. Second one is with the map, so it's kind of informing you. Third one is another kind of recessional line map that you see wherever you go in Greenland. And then the last one is another Landsat. So I did that for a while, from 06 to 2013, using many sources. But I realized, as I did with the Greenland thing, when I just showed you, that I had to be there. It was enough of just using scientific sources, other people's imagery. If I was really going to comprehend this on a deeper level, I had to bear witness. And so that's what I began to do. And from 2013 on, I've continued this process with Richard, just going all over the world through many different ways, through grants, students on ice. We were both educators going to Antarctica, many different ways. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about this journey. Now, another thing I wanted to share with you is, again, as I said earlier, how do I go about doing it? How do I learn? Well, I learn from many sources. I'm a newspaper junkie, and I know I look at it online, but I actually like to get the New York Times. So here's a source, more information I get on the internet, and when I read about Petermann Glacier in 2010, I was fascinated about this. See that crack there? That was a break in the ice that started. It was a northern part of the western part of Greenland, and it started breaking up, and then it fell. And that gave me information that allowed me to make paintings about that. And when I have museum shows or wherever they are, there's always a lot of wall text. It's one of the ways that I'm communicating about climate change. But another way I'm learning is conferences. And I've been really lucky. I've been sort of introduced to a world that I didn't grow up with, the scientific world. And in 2012, I think that one's from 2012, I was asked to go to San Francisco to be on a panel that was about how artists talk about climate change. And I've been doing that kind of stuff ever since. And just going to conferences sometimes when I'm not a feature, but when I want to be there. This was a really important conference where I think I did speak there, right? 2016, yeah. Anyway, coolest thing about this, first of all, Naomi Oreskes was there, who is one of my heroines. And you can, is she in this? No, she's not in that slide. I'll have to change that. I must have one with her too. But this is December 2016. Does that mean anything to people? Right. So they were scared. And this is the first time that a bunch of scientists, I think, got out there in the public and said, they started protesting. It was an amazing time. They were talking at a lot of the sessions about how to save the data. They were really worried that it was going to be taken away. It was a very scary time. So I thought this was a really great slide. And I've been fortunate to go to a lot of different places. Richard and I went to New Zealand. Why? Because, well, there are glaciers there that are melting, and we wanted to see them before they were all gone, Franz Josef. So I was going to speak at the university, and then they wrote and they said, well, there's going to be an international cryosphere conference. You should talk there too. Again, it wasn't the talk that was great. It was about meeting Eric Rigno, who is an incredible scientist from JPL, who talked about what's happening now in Antarctica and how they're so worried about if that cracks, you're really going to have a hell of a lot more sea level rise. So I go to a lot of these things. And the other thing I do is I try, whenever I can, to actually go into the field with researchers. So this is an example of when Richard and I we had a residency going around Svalbard. Do you know where Svalbard is? Anybody? You're one of the few. It's 400 miles north of Norway, and it's 10 degrees below the pole. So it's really up there. And we got this residency to go on a 3-masted barkentine. But before we did, I somehow arranged, another long story, don't have time, to actually go on the land, the glacier, before we just went around on a boat, because I like aerial things, as you might have noticed, so that's what I did. But here's some more other examples of other places we've been to get research, and the research continues. This guy is in Philadelphia. I came back from being in the middle of nowhere at American Samoa. We were gone for a whole month, and I read in the New York Times about this guy's discovery, and I said, oh my God, is this Philadelphia? And I went all the way, so we became friends and we went there. This is very recent. I'll tell you a little bit more about that. So all this research, all this information, what do I do with it? I bring it back to my lab, to my studio, and I make art about it. So again, you know, one slide for 1 year. Obviously, there's more work that's done, but this is a way that you have a sense of what happens in the studio. 2014, yeah, that was right after we had gone to Svalbard. And that's actually a set of 2 images that come from their archives. I went to the Norwegian Polar Institute, where Jack worked, and did a lot of research and used some of those maps. 2015, that was right after we came back from Greenland. And this is towards the end of my ice exploration, and that's the book that came after that, because I have switched gears, as you will see. So this was a show that happened in 2017, and this is my shameless promotion for you to buy the book. Okay, so we saw this image earlier today. Well, did all the ice, you know, learned a lot about sea level rise and glaciers, and I'm still reading about how the world is heating up, and I started thinking about coral reefs and the oceans. It was sort of logical because we were in New Zealand. Once you're in New Zealand, you have to go to Australia. Once you're in Australia, you have to fly over the Great Barrier Reef. And so we did. Took some photos, and you know, I started learning and reading about that. And serendipitously, we also got involved in a project that a cousin of mine was just starting, named Evan Zaporin, who is out of MIT with Christine, and they were both divers. And we started talking, and they said, oh, we're doing this project. And they started telling me about it. And all of a sudden, she has this brainstorm, well, you should be part of the project. This is what we're going to do. We're going to go dive at all the national parks that have reefs. She was applying for a grant. And it was a music grant, MAP grant. And she said, you have to be part of it. You're an ecological artist. And I looked at her and said, yeah, I guess you could call me that, but I don't swim. So that's a little bit of a problem. But anyway, we talked some more, and she had her whole plan. She's a musician. They're world-renowned musicians and composers, and that's what she wanted to do. She was going to make a video underwater and then project it in a planetarium. And I'm thinking, well, where do I fit in? And then, of course, I realized, well, I fit in because I make art. So we went, we got the grant. Unfortunately, it's the only grant we've gotten, and they've moved on to other stuff, and I've kind of stuck a little bit more with the ocean. So this is an example of us there. So how did we gather information there? Well, Richard got himself a drone, so we didn't have to worry about getting planes. Actually, we tried. There was no way we could we tried to fly over American Samoa also, but it was impossible. So we had information from the air, made images from the air, and I did learn how to swim, not well, but enough to, you know, do a little bit of snorkeling. So we also got images with our GoPro under the water. And then I went back to the studio. This was a real challenge for me because I had no idea when I agreed to go on this project with them how or what I was going to paint. Because I knew I'm not going to draw coral and I'm not going to paint pretty fish. what am I going to do in terms of who I am? And it was a really wonderful challenge because it meant that I had to invent and I had to really think and experiment, make a lot of bad paintings. And then I kind of figured it out. And what I figured out is I had to totally change the way I work. It wasn't going to be vertical anymore, and it wasn't going to be with oil paint. I started using acrylics, I started pouring them, and I started using a compressor to push the paint around. So there's a studio view right before I was preparing for a show at the National Academy of Sciences. And that gives you a sense of what was going on, plus all the way on the right wall, you can see those round things. Well, those were lenticulars, which I'll show you a little bit about in a minute. And the way I started doing that is I collaborated with a former assistant of mine who only did lenticular imagery. What does that mean? It's sort of, I think this audience remembers Cracker Jacks. So you know when you got that little plastic thing and you would look at it, it would be a clown, and then it would be, that's what a lenticular basically is. So we were creating them with about 30 different images. It's an animation. And let's see, there you go. I didn't know I could just do it that way. It's wonderful. So this is a demonstration of what we were doing. We had the tripod there, and we're clicking away. We'd have 50 or 60 kind of shots, and then we would take about 30 that really worked. And how did we get it to move? We were using oil, baby oil with pigment in it, and also liquid soap. And you know, they have an emulsification kind of thing going on, and that's how we did it. And that resulted in, these are GIFs. They're not really, you know, you'd have to be in front of it to really see it exactly. But here's an example of what the lenticulars were like. And they all were based on my experience of going to the Pacific and also the research that I had done. While we were doing that, and I was watching it, I realized that what we were doing was so cool, it could be a video. And these are some installation shots from that exhibition. And again, shameless promo here. That book is available too. So that happened from August 2018 to January 2019. And in between, there was another American Geophysical Union conference. And I was lucky enough to, you know, get a poster session and also a panel. So there you have that, and it was at the, and they were actually invited, not all of them, not all 26,000 members who were all there, but there was a reception for the show during the American Geophysical Union conference. So that's done, and I'm still making paintings. So these are some examples of some of the work, studio again, of what went on after that. Remember I said I met that guy in Philadelphia, that one, Eric Cordes, who runs this incredible, he made this discovery of a 23-mile, I think I'm not exaggerating, long coral that's underneath, deep. There's deep sea coral. I didn't even know there was deep sea coral. When I learned about coral, I assumed it's all 15 degrees above and below the equator. You know, it needs photosynthesis, and that's how it lives. But there is coral that lives way deep underneath, and he discovered that along the South Carolinas. And it was really great because they were going to do extraction. And because of his discovery, that stopped. So he's very cool. So while I'm there, I see they have all these broken pieces of Lophilia. And I said to his assistant, I said, well, you know, what are you going to do with all the ones there? Oh, well, I don't know. We'll probably throw them out. I said, hi, can I have some? So there's a painting where you actually have, I started introducing a three-dimensional piece into it. Maps, as you might have, are very important to me. I mean, you saw them earlier. This was a map that was actually from a painting that was at the show. And on the right-hand corner, this is Hawaiian archipelago. And we should give credit to President Obama, who made all of the archipelago basically a national monument. And for some reason, you know who hasn't figured that out yet, so it's still there. But what you have in the corner is Midway Atoll. So one of my collectors was, I think it was Pam, and Joe, and Pam goes, well, what is an atoll? And I go, I wasn't sure, I'm not a scientist, right? But I said, well, I think it's reefs, the coral that collects on a caldera, because I knew about volcanoes. But I wasn't really sure. And then I did my research, and I did another painting actually about that. And guess what? Who knew that Darwin wrote a book on coral? This is the way I learned. It's like one thing leads to another. And he actually had this theory of subsidence. And it was proven I guess it was last century. It was proven, yes, it was last century, when they were doing the experiments in the 50s with other atolls, Bikini. There actually was a geologist that was part of the team. And you know what he did? Because he was a geologist, he knew about that, and he was on the team, he made sure, he told them that they have to do a core sample. But his reason to do the core sample was to find out if Darwin was correct, and he was. So here's another example of a painting that just is 2019, and I'm still looking at maps, and I'm still thinking about coral, and I started thinking about these NOAA maps. One of the reasons I did is that Mark Aiken, who's in charge of the NOAA alert that goes on in DC, was on my panel and became friends. He also was the key scientific advisor for Chasing Coral, which is a great movie. You should all see it. It's similar to Chasing Ice. So I started a series where I'm putting his maps into the paintings. Another way of melding data, information with aesthetics. Then I had this idea that, because I knew these maps, well, maybe I should do something that's about the whole world, because I keep looking at all these maps, we all do, and I happen to have 2 stretchers that were 50 by 88. So I figured I'd use them, right? I didn't know what I was going to do with them. They were from other paintings, but they were there. So I did the glacier map, and I decided to put this band across the top. So here we are in April of this year, and I'm playing around with this glacier map, and I'm also finding one that's all about coral, and I'm just riffing on this, and I keep ordering more stretchers. There's my reef one, the painting that has that. And you might notice if I go back, all of them have that bar, the map bar, underneath, which was one way of unifying the whole series. And the series just kept growing. Actually, I don't have the last ones here, I'm sorry. Yeah, well, that's the last one there. So at this point, and they're done, and they're 56 feet long in total. And the curators who came to do a studio visit last June want them in this American University Museum. So another thing that you might have seen earlier when I said that we go to all these different places and visit, we were in Florida this year, and we discovered coral fossil reefs. Well, I should have known about them all along. Have you ever heard of Coral Gables? I've been going there for years, and it never occurred to me that it was all about coral. And the Keys, they're only built on 130,000 years worth of coral limestone. So we started getting involved with that. Here's a painting about that. This is this summer, you know what's going on there. So there's a studio where I was like thinking about both of those things at the same time. But there's one of those things about the research. Coral. When we were there, and it was really funny, Richard and I were there twice. We were there in December for family, and we discovered this coral, and I posted on Instagram, because I do that, and a postdoc that we met at HIMB in Hawaii posts back and says, well, if you're interested in coral fossil limestone, you have to go to the Windley Key Coral Fossil Historical Park on the Keys. Who knew there was such a thing? But we went, and I did a series of photographs. That's all about coral fossil limestone. So that is really bringing you up to date. And I'm continuing public engagement. What's the point of having art exhibitions? Well, I love seeing my work hung. I like it to be sold. But if I agree to do a show now, it has to have public engagement as part of the mix, or I won't do it. And it's really, I'm very pleased that I have that philosophy, because it works. So I do public engagement during shows, but I do them at other times too. And there's a recent one for Earth Day this year with kids, because I like to talk about kids too. So I think that does it for now. And that's a studio shot again of just a few weeks ago. So, questions? Thank you.
Diane, what kind of questions, I'm sorry. When you do this public engagement with younger people, teenagers, college students, and little ones, what are some of the questions that they ask?
Well, a lot of them are in the know, but then the best part is when they're not in the know or when they challenge you. And I've learned to be polite and say, that's a point well taken. But I remember I did a show at Keene University, and there was this really smart-ass kind of guy, and at the opening, and he's really confronting me about nuclear physicists and debating stuff about climate change. And I listened, and I said, well, you know what? There's going to be a panel tomorrow morning. See, that's the hook. Why don't you come and ask them? They're going to know much more than me. So on the panel was a NOAA guy, and so that's one way of dealing with it. Another experience is we were at Colgate, and one of the professors, right, they said the kids are depressed. And I don't know if that was true in any of your teaching, but I know you're such a good entertainer, they wouldn't be depressed. But that they're worried, and they are depressed. So we talk about that. But I give them information and I encourage them to get involved. And that's one of the things I'll say, what can we do? Look what you've done, what can we do? Well, look at Greta. I mean, there's a lot that can be done, and I am of the opinion, and I think Tim said this, and so did you, especially Matt, it's a mega problem and it has to be dealt with on that higher level. It's a political policy problem. We can, not drink water out of plastic bottles or straws and all that stuff, but it's way bigger than that. And it comes from our having the passion to move the deciders, okay? And so we talk about that. That's one of the things we do.
In all your explorations, does anything give you hope for the future?
Well, speaking to people gives me hope. I don't think we've observed anything that gives us hope.
American Samoa?
Yeah. Why?
It's untouched.
Oh, that's true. Yeah. And Molokai, yeah. No, there are places that give me hope, and there is conservation going on, for sure. But, we've seen glaciers that are melting away. It's one of, when I went to Glacier National Park in 2011, that was named because there were 150 glaciers, right? They're only less than 25 now, so it's kind of scary. What gives me hope is also marching. Climate marches, we're going to do one on next Friday. People are really caring, I think, more than ever. And look at the they're all talking about it in the election. That's new. So I have a lot of hope, on that level.
Yeah, I read an article recently, and I wish I could remember where, that said there will be no change without the continuing pressure of these grassroots organizations.
Oh, totally.
It's absolutely essential.
It's essential. It's
What a
essential.
wonderful presentation. I want to invite myself to your studio.
I live in Philadelphia. Come on down.
It's really amazing. Just as a side question, the people you deal with quite frequently, the scientists in these governmental agencies, how are they getting through? What is their?
You mean managing? You mean
Yes,
coping with?
Just coping. Yes, thank you.
Well, do you remember the rangers at the Winley Key who couldn't talk to us?
Yes, you're right.
That's recent, though.
That's very recent. Yeah, we were at Windley Key in March of this year. And one of the things we do is we video. And so we have these conversations, which I hope to incorporate in this show that's coming up. So I love talking to people, and we have these exchanges. You know, I ask them questions, and we met this one young woman who's giving us information. Well, but you know, I'm really not the one. You should speak to this person. I said, well, can you call her up? And she basically said, I really can't talk to you on the premises. She was really very evasive, you're right. They're scared, you know.
Well, it's their job.
It's their job, yeah.
Diane, what's in your head ready to go on the canvas?
I don't know what's in my head, I just go. And then the canvas, you know, I know it sounds trite, it speaks to you. I mean, you know, I have some idea, but, you know, when you're really in the moment and you're creating, what's in my head is everything I showed you in terms of all the information I have. So the information is somehow mixed together and then it comes out in different ways. And I keep thinking of new ideas. I mean, like, yeah, see that black one over there? That's not that way anymore, but, you know, it's the third one from that Noah series. And I just got a new black paint, very special paint, so I was playing with it. And this painting, I don't have it here, but I think it's on my no, it's not on my website yet because it's not finished. But it became a very dark red painting, and I was doing it on 9/11. So, you know, I don't know.
So, on the face of right here, on the face of it, artistic truth is different than scientific truth.
For sure.
So artistic truth, on first blush, relies on the impressionistic, the emotional,
Yes.
the internal, the subjective. Scientific truth, on the face of it, rests on
Fact. Yes,
data,
right.
the objective, even though there have been many philosophers and historians to critique that notion and point at social construction of science. But
Right.
I'm curious, what kind of truth are you after? And has your work become more realist as it's become more data-driven?
Well, I think you saw it's become less realist in these later paintings. They're much more abstract.
So what's the truth you're after?
Well, the truth I'm after is the connection between the emotional and the factual. And it's sort of like, you know, Goya's May 3rd or Guernica, Picasso. I mean, it's an art, it's another medium expressing an issue. You can get the facts, and then, you know, that's what novels are about, or plays, or operas. So it's a melding of it. But you mentioned the word emotion, and I think that's why scientists like artists to talk about what they do, is they can bring that emotional element into it. Scientists are, especially this guy, they're as emotional as anybody else, but they have to stick to their data, whereas artists can kind of harness the emotion that people have, especially, and these are large paintings, and that is part of the engagement. I mean, they've proven psychologically that people respond more to images on an emotional level that might move them to do something, you know, that we need done. I don't know if that answers your question.
There's one more on there, I think.
You probably already answered it, but it's obviously you were always a welcome member of these scientific teams, and the inclusion of an artist in the scientific team is something that I've been always fascinated by. I don't know if you want to just embellish that at all.
Well, I remember I gave a talk at CUNY, and Marco Tedesco, who's a pretty well-known scientist, rushed up to me, and he said, "Oh, this is fantastic. Your work is great. My wife's an art historian. I have to take you to the Arctic." And I said, "Take me." I mean, you know, but what I realized is it's very good for NSF grants to have what they call outreach, which I'm fine. I can be used anywhere to go to the Arctic, to go to Greenland. I mean, that's okay. We actually never got there with Marco, but he was just there, goes there often. But it's about outreach. So when they do their grants, if you're doing some very obscure study that measures, you know, mass balance and all this stuff, how do you get the money? How do you make it relevant? Well, you have to have outreach. And what better outreach could you have than an artist? There's a whole program called the Artists and Writers Program in Antarctica. I've never, people have said, why haven't you done that? Because I don't want to be in Antarctica for 4 or 5 months. But we've been to Antarctica. But so that's, you know, so they want it for that reason, but they also appreciate our being able to emotionally articulate what they are doing in a measuring, what Dave was saying, in a measuring way. Yeah.
Any more questions?
I have a question.
Oh, my husband. You always do this to me.
How do you account for your increased massive carbon footprint?
Yeah. That question
It seems
has,
like you fly around everywhere.
yeah, right.
Polluting the sky.
She doesn't walk to the Arctic.
No, I don't walk to the Arctic. That question has been asked before, and my smart answer is, and it's true, I haven't eaten meat in 40 years, so that's something. But I feel very guilty about that, and the only way I can answer it is I think that what I'm doing sort of balances off. I'm doing it so that I can get the information and I can then share it, and that's why I do public engagement. Okay, it's a way, it's a payback. But you know, you were talking about, you were talking about cap and trade, but also I'm part of a Lindblad. You know, he's very interested in the environment, and I should say they just purchased 4 or 5 of my pieces. They're actually going to have their next ship have real art on it, permanent collection. And he speaks about trying to, you know, figure out new fuel ways of, you know, so this thing is going on. I mean, they're trying. So I do have a carbon footprint. And they're offsets. But I want to ask you about that, you know, I should have asked you earlier about the offsets and how that works. We've never really known which ones to, you know, what is the best system, because some people say it doesn't really work. So I'm looking into it. Okay, thank you.
So.
Oh, wait, can I say one more thing? This lady is a national treasure.
I think that today we have had a treasure here. As diversity is environmentally correct, we have presented today a philosopher, a lawyer, a chemist, and an artist who had the gift of curiosity, which Einstein thinks it's the most important gift, and I think he's right. He usually is. To develop new interests throughout their careers, and as important, new skills to address the challenges that they've encountered. I'm grateful to all of them for sharing their knowledge with us, the Schemmel Forum, and for their commitment to making this world just a little bit better, even more so.
Thank you. You're the best.
And now join us for a little reception before we leave. Thank you.